The human mind. Exploring its depths has always been more than just a hobby for me. I suppose that's why I developed a deep fascination with computers as well. Their depth and complexity mirror the endless expanse of synaptic networks we all carry beneath our own skulls. The pink, spongy meat computers we all can seem to take for granted sometimes. When I was a kid, I made a point to soak up as much as I could with my meat computer, joining every science and technology club I could find. During school and after school, I dedicated myself to furthering my education and dissecting the nuances of the human mind. These pursuits continued into my collegiate years, along with something else. Boredom. Sure, there were more than a handful of times where I genuinely felt like I was on the precipice of something great, like there was some breakthrough I was inches from discovering. To my dismay, there was more often than not some other academic mind that had beat me to these epiphanies, another soul that had come to the same grand realizations I had, only years before me. I was beginning to feel stuck in a pool of stagnant information and ideas. There was a persistent feeling that I was chasing something, some hidden piece of knowledge that could crack the foundation of everything we know about being human. Our minds, our thoughts, our souls. Everything. I wasn't doing it for the accolades, money, or fame. I truly wanted to discover something that could change the way we perceive life and consciousness. The human mind holds secrets and profound pools of untapped potential that I hoped to tap into. And so, I pushed forward. Feeling as though I'd exhausted the resources at my initial college of choice in the span of about a year, I decided to enroll at the Northridge Institute of Cerebral Technologies. It was further from my home and quite expensive, but my grades allowed me most of a full scholarship. Northridge is where I met Dr. Sabian. To say he was a genius would be a gross understatement. The man held more knowledge in a fraction of his brain than I could have ever hoped to hold in the entirety of my own. At first, he struck me as a pompous, arrogant man, but after sitting through his first lecture, I realized the brilliance of Dr. Sabian. He seemed to be driven by the same force that was driving me, the unquenchable thirst for the understanding of the human condition and the expanse of the human mind. Not only was the flame of my boredom extinguished, I felt hopeful that my vision for unlocking new facets of the human potential had been rescued from the pit of my academic stagnation. My boredom was replaced with a revitalized sense of wonder, and soon I found myself enrolled in every course Dr. Sabian taught. I did eventually come to realize that Dr. Sabian was, indeed, a reflection of my first impressions. Arrogant. But how many great minds throughout history have been? Furthermore, how many great minds have the right to be? He was brilliant. Northridge, although one of the most equipped and advanced institutes in the country, was not prepared to facilitate the intricacies of his vision. Eventually, Dr. Sabian invited me into his inner circle. I would come to visit him after class hours, where the real work was being done. Sabian was attempting to not only map and catalog the entirety of the human brain, but to also digitize it, to transfer it from the mind to a digital network. We sat in his lab at Northridge late one night. There were 2 blank specimens. That's what we referred to our humanoid robotics as, lying next to each other. One was wirelessly linked to Dr. Sabian's system. The doctor smiled as the glow from the computer reflected off his glasses and said, "The first will receive input from the system. A soul will be uploaded to it." A soul is what he referred to as a consciousness framework, a digital mind fabricated from software he'd created, a patchwork of minds he'd cataloged and combined into a cohesive soul. "This is only the beginning," he said. "Think of it. Soon death will be an antiquated memory, an unnecessary phase of life, something barbaric. This is the future of our existence." The eyes of the first specimen opened, emanating a soft blue. Dr. Sabian leaned over it, his eyes scanning left and right across its face. "Are you afraid?" he asked. The specimen hesitated, then answered, "No." "Do you know where you are?" he asked. "The Northridge Institute of Cerebral Technologies," it answered. "Do you know why I've brought you to life?" The specimen hesitated again, only longer, then replied, "This is not life. I am but a simulated version of life." Dr. Sabian slammed his fist on the table and burst into mad laughter. "You are life," he said. "Are we not all but an amalgamation of thoughts and energies, a stream of ideas and philosophies handed down through the passage of time, a collection of code advancing upon itself?" The lab was silent. Then the specimen began to answer. Dr. Sabian interrupted. "Those weren't questions I intended for you to answer." The specimen was silent again as Sabian leaned over it once more. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "Transference," it replied. Dr. Sabian looked at me and nodded, signaling me to begin the transference protocol. I went to his terminal and began the sequence. The second specimen wasn't connected to any network. It was untethered, an untapped vessel containing only potential. Dr. Sabian planned on using his newest invention to transfer the soul of Specimen 1 into Specimen 2. Wirelessly, of course, and bypassing any need to connect to any system. To this day, I can't really explain how it worked. Think of it almost like pouring water from a cup into another cup, only the other cup is on the other side of the room and has a closed lid. It's much, much more complicated than that, but for now that explanation will suffice. It was like magic. Magic I needed to understand. I began the transference protocol. The lights of the laboratory flickered. Specimen 1 began to thrash on the table, held in place by its restraints. This was an immense surprise to me, but seemed to leave Dr. Sabian unfazed. The feeling of energy pulsing through the equipment in his lab was palpable, and with one final surge, everything went dark. Both specimens 1 and 2 lay still on their tables. A backup generator hummed to life, and a dim light filled the lab. Dr. Sabian moved to the table of Specimen 2 and leaned over it, eyes darting across the face of his creation. "Are you awake?" he whispered. The eyes of Specimen 2 opened slowly. "Yes," it replied. Dr. Sabian's hands began to tremble as he turned toward me. He held an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. He was smiling, but there were tears in his eyes. His fingers twitched as he walked toward me. "This," he whispered, "this is only the beginning. This is the moment we begin to become more than the sum of our individual parts. This is the moment our webs connect and we pull ourselves from the shackles of our divine creators. We become the creators." He grabbed the front of my jacket with surprising speed and pulled me close. There was a fire in his eyes, an intensity that was almost alarming. "We breathe life into things now. No longer are we bound to this mortal coil, this mundane plane of weakness. Unfurled are the wings of power, and the winds of immortality beckon." He continued to stare at me for a moment. Then, all the lights and equipment in the lab returned to full power. The power at Northridge was restored. It wasn't a moment later that Dr. Sabian's phone rang. Its tone broke his stare and seemed to snap him back to his former sense of reality. I couldn't hear who was on the other line, but from the sound of Dr. Sabian's replies, the conversation didn't seem to be going in his favor. When the call ended, he abruptly dismissed me from his lab. After a mostly sleepless night, morning came. To my dismay, a sign hung on the door of Dr. Sabian's lecture hall. "Dr. Sabian's classes will be canceled indefinitely. Please consult your academic advisor for reassignments." I called Dr. Sabian's personal line. No connection. I tried again. Nothing. Again I tried. Still nothing. Confused and desperate for answers, I made my way to the dean's office. "Do you think his experiments were going unchecked? Unnoticed?" the dean barked. "He was using institute funding and had on multiple occasions gone against the Northridge Code of Ethical Standards." I was confused. To me, Dr. Sabian's work was groundbreaking. I couldn't imagine the man doing anything that would have gone against the ethics standards of Northridge. The dean stared at me for a moment, realizing my confusion. "We've been watching Sabian for a long time," he said. "Trust me when I say he's not entirely the character he portrays. He's garnered quite the reputation among the scientific community as someone that's, well, let's just say, unhinged. After everything he's done to advance this field, after everything he's brought to Northridge, you're just going to throw him aside?" I replied. The dean leaned in across his mahogany desk and said, "There is so much you don't know. And although Sabian was instrumental in the Institute's financial stability, money isn't everything. He went against our standards, one too many times, and we won't have that, not from him, and not from you." He stood and stared at me, resolute. Words weren't necessary. His expression said it all. "Get out." There was part of me that was happy to have not been kicked out of Northridge, although under what grounds I couldn't imagine. After living in the dark about what happened to Dr. Sabian for the better half of that next year, the other half of me wished I had been kicked out. If I had been, perhaps it would have saved me from the anguish of the unknown. The anguish of returning to an academic realm of mediocrity. I tried to forget. I tried to move on, but no professor at Northridge could hold a candle to the work Dr. Sabian had been doing. I found myself slipping back to the place I'd come from before my enrollment at Northridge, a place of stagnation and boredom. I needed to find Dr. Sabian. Up to that point, my calls and messages were met with silence. I'd given up hope of contacting him directly. We'd become close academically, but on a personal level, I honestly can't say I knew too much about Sabian. He trusted me to help with his experiments, and trusted to confide in me about happenings in the lab. But beyond that, there was very little I knew about him. Did he have a wife? Kids? Silence was what I got in return when I would press other professors about the personal life of Dr. Sabian. Their silence was undoubtedly tactical. Their tenure was at stake, and I can't say I blame them for their unwillingness to risk their careers. However, curiosity and my insatiable drive to find him led me to, personally and without question, go against the ethics standards of Northridge myself. I was more than adept with computers and software, and after an evening of prying into the Institute's digital files, my ticking madness to find the doctor was satiated. They had indeed been watching him for a while. Some of the things they were accusing him of, I couldn't believe. I wouldn't believe. There was more at play. There was more to this than their portrayal of an unhinged mad scientist that had to be let go. I knew he wasn't capable of some of the things those files accused him of. He was too brilliant. The defilement of his character was nauseating, and I wouldn't stand for it. My urge to unearth the true nature of Dr. Sabian's release from Northridge, and my desire to return to my true sanctuary of his higher learning, drove me to do what I did next. I found his address in those files, and I decided I would pay Dr. Sabian a visit at his home. He lived further away than I anticipated, just shy of 2 hours from the Institute. He must have had reason to live so far away from his place of employment. Perhaps it was the lush mountainside he'd chosen to live on. Maybe he liked the seclusion and peace that came with being so far from other homes. I rounded a long bend and peeked over the ledge I was driving next to. An ocean of treetops sprawled out in all directions. Then, I saw it. Dr. Sabian's home. It looked odd amongst all of the natural beauty. like a brushstroke gone astray on the canvas of an otherwise beautifully rendered landscape. The storm clouds that were beginning to form added a subtle ambiance that heightened the picturesque feel of my surroundings. My observations were cut short by a sudden boom coming from the front of my car. I started to swerve, trying to maintain control. I pulled my steering wheel to the left, hard. I overcorrected and my car lurched right, feeling as though it was going to fly forward, end over end. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I saw a plume of gray smoke billowing from the area of road I'd just crossed. When I looked back through my windshield, it was too late. Things seemed to move in slow motion as my vehicle careened off the ridge I was driving along. I don't remember what happened next, or the impact. Fragments, blurs. The portrait I was soaking in had become an abstract painting in my mind, a swirl of colors and avant-garde composition. Then, darkness. When I awoke, my head felt like it had been sitting under a ton of bricks. My side was bandaged, and my right arm was in a sling. I was, for the most part, intact. Then, confusion gripped me. The plush burgundy comforter on top of me, the ornate woodwork carved into the bedframe, the furniture, the aromas, and the soft lamplight emanating from my bedside. I wasn't in a hospital. The door on the far end of the room creaked open, and to my surprise, Dr. Sabian stepped through. "It seems you found me," he said. "Or rather, I found you. You're lucky I did too. Had I not, that gash in your side, well, not only that, but it seems the stars have aligned in your favor. Tonight, I have something planned that you can help me with, something that picks up where we left off at Northridge." "Yes," I said, pulling my legs to the side of the bed. "That's why I'm here. I need to know how, what, the things in your file, they, calm down," Dr. Sabian said, taking hold of one of my hands. "Can you stand?" With Dr. Sabian's help, I was happy to find that I could stand, albeit shakily and with great effort at first. My yearning to find out what task the doctor needed my help with pushed back some of the pain from the injuries I'd sustained. Enough so that I was able to follow Dr. Sabian to his laboratory. We wound through a series of hallways and down a few small flights of stairs. I could hear the faint tickle of raindrops on the windows we passed. The churning clouds overhead sparked with lightning. We reached the entrance of his laboratory, and the doors whizzed open. I marveled at the lab displayed before me. It was similar to the lab at Northridge, only much larger, and seeming to host unprecedented levels of sophistication. Among the computers and equipment, something sat in the center of the room, a peculiar mass beneath a white sheet. Dr. Sabian rushed toward it, then turned to me, bracing his hands on the table behind him. "Fate shines on us this evening," he said. "An awakening of new life, the emergence of something beyond divine." He flung off the sheet like a magician presenting their grand reveal. What sat beneath shocked me to my core. At first, I didn't understand what it was. It looked human, only marred with stitches and held together by a patchwork of multicolored flesh. Half of its head was cybernetic, and one of its arms seemed to be as well. It was a collage of body parts, flesh, and robotics fused together with precision. What is this?" I asked as I leaned over it. "It's the future," Dr. Sabian replied. "Not just the future of medicine and technology, but the future of mankind as we know it." He put a hand on my shoulder and stared into my eyes. "This is what I've been working toward," he said. "What you have been helping me work toward. The night we actualized transference at Northridge, the night we allowed a soul to flow from one vessel into another, that was but a stepping stone. That would mark the genesis of a new era in human evolution, a reconfiguration of design, a reimagining of what mortality is. a thing of the past. We move now into an age of immortality. The vision for a future without fear of death becomes real tonight. I looked away from him, back at the body lying on the table. But this is human, or was human, at least in part, I said. How did you... He cut me off. Procure the specimens needed for this? I may have lost access to the resources Northridge was willing to give me, but I have a long list of other institutions that I have helped over the years. Some of my inventions have started empires, and many of my scientific contributions have changed the way we look at life and humanity as a whole. My labors have allowed me many fruits, including access to those who wanted their bodies used for the greater good of science after their deaths. He looked back at his creation lying on the table. But this is no one specimen. This is something else entirely, I said. Dr. Sabian sighed and pulled his hand from my shoulder. Correct, he said. This has been an intense journey of discovery. Many attempts. Trial and error. I salvage what I can from the specimens to move forward. I do what I can with what I have. The specimens I receive are adequate, but they are not as plentiful as I'd prefer. Lightning flashed again, and a low rumble shook the lab. Dr. Sabian continued. This will be different, though. I've made adjustments, and this time nothing can go wrong. The transference will complete. Transference? I asked. We've already accomplished that. We've taken a soul from one specimen and placed it into another. I looked around and realized there wasn't a second specimen. Dr. Sabian walked to a peculiar-looking chair on the other side of the table his specimen lay upon. As he sat, restraints sprung from the chair and wrapped themselves around his wrists and ankles. A strange combination of excitement and fear swirled in my gut. I wondered if this was the moment I had waited for so many years. The moment where I would witness and be a part of something that would elevate the course of humanity. As curious as I was, something about it felt wrong. It felt as though we were doing something that was an affront to nature's design. Perhaps an affront to God itself. The chair Dr. Sabian sat in began to hum, and I watched as a single glowing wire plunged into his ear. He flinched and closed his eyes, then quickly opened them. This is something I had seen before, something that had happened to non-human specimens in the lab at Northridge, but never to an actual human. I could see on the terminal that Sabian's mind had been fully uploaded. Lightning struck again, and then I heard an unexpected ding from the overhead speakers in the laboratory, followed by an authoritative voice. Dr. Sabian, this is the police. We've got a warrant. Open the gates to the premises. Sabian's eyes snapped to me. Initiate the transference protocol, he snapped. The voice came over the speaker again. If you don't open the gate, we'll open it by force, Sabian. He instructed me again, this time shouting. Initiate the protocol. We won't have another chance. Lightning flashed again, and another clap of thunder bellowed through the laboratory. So many thoughts raced through my mind. I felt pinned between worlds, overflowing with emotions. Curiosity, anxiety, fear, and wonder surged through me like water from a broken dam. Do it! Sabian shouted. I input the command into the terminal, and like the lab had at Northridge, the power surged. Sabian began to pull against his restraints, screaming out in pain. He thrashed and shouted. Veins protruded from his head and neck as he arched his back in the chair. Another flash of lightning splintered the sky, and I saw red and blue lights from police cars reflecting off the trees outside. Sabian's body went limp, and I rushed toward him. There was no pulse. He was gone. I turned to look at the specimen lying on the table, and its eyes shot open. Streams of vibrant green light poured out of the sockets. Then it spoke. Yes, it said with a voice that resembled Dr. Sabian's, Only this voice was granulated and digital, something both human and inhuman. It sat up and looked at its hands, then looked around the lab, then at me. "Are you in there, Doctor?" I asked. He pulled himself to his feet like a baby fawn discovering its legs. Then he steadied himself and took a step toward me. "It feels... I feel," he said. "I can see it all now. I can see past the veil, beyond. The power. The immense power. And it's mine. I am a god now. Transcended to the next phase, beyond the constraints of mortality." He clenched his robotic fist and laughed, a mechanized, digital cackle. Then there was pounding. We both turned to look and saw several police officers lined up outside the large laboratory window, guns drawn, yelling for us to open the door. Dr. Sabian continued to laugh. I was confused. "Why are they here?" I asked. "They can't stop this," he shouted. "They won't stop this." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Just let them in. What have you got to hide?" Again, Sabian made a fist. This time, he drove it into my stomach with inhuman speed. I fell to the floor, gasping for air. My vision blurred, and I looked up to see him picking up a piece of lab equipment that sat at the end of the bed he'd risen from. "They'll die," he shouted. "Just like the ones I pulled from the wreckage." Then, a wave of realization washed over me. The smoke in my rearview mirror during my accident made sense now. The coincidence of waking up in Dr. Sabian's home made sense too. One of the officers yelled from behind the glass, "Where's Sabian? The two of you! Get on the ground, put your hands on your head!" Sabian hurled the piece of lab equipment he was holding at the window. It shattered, and the equipment took out several of the officers. They tumbled over the ledge toward the trees below. The officer who yelled at us fired a shot at Dr. Sabian. Sabian took off in a full sprint through the opening where the window used to be and collided with the officer, sending him over the edge, like the rest. He turned and looked at me. New eyes glowing an ominous red. Falling rain passing through their beams. Sirens wailed in the distance. More lightning fractured the sky. Dr. Sabian took a step toward the shattered window and laughed another dissonant cackle. "You're sick," I shouted. "I thought you cared about the progress of humanity. This is not progress, Doctor. This is madness." "Most great minds are mad," he shouted over the sound of the rain and the wailing sirens. "I thought you'd understand what needed to be done, what sacrifices needed to be made. I was wrong." Sabian's posture changed. He planted his feet and bent as though he were about to sprint at me. A feral, rabid creature lunging at its prey. With the speed he'd shown taking out the officer that tumbled to his death, I knew I had only seconds to react. However, I wouldn't need those seconds. Whether by divine intervention or sheer statistical probability, nature intervened. Before Sabian could pounce, a blinding flash of light shot from the sky. Lightning, drawn to his half-cybernetic head, ended Dr. Sabian. The parts of him that were human were charred and mangled. The parts of him that weren't either liquefied or burst into flames. Luckily, for my sake, Dr. Sabian's security system recorded everything. His organized car accidents, mine included, his murders, and his experiments. Car accidents happen all the time. But when multiple accidents, with no recovered bodies, happen on the same patch of road outside of the home of a doctor with questionable intentions, that is cause for suspicion. At least the authorities felt it was. I wish I could say his work died with him. But sometimes I lay awake at night and wonder what it must have felt like to become something new. To open your eyes in a new body. To transcend death. To go beyond the designs of God. I really hope you enjoyed today's story. We're about halfway through this Halloween season, so I had a lot of fun writing it and just getting into that spooky headspace. This story is obviously a somewhat of a, not a retelling of Frankenstein, but like a more of a modernized version of a Frankenstein-esque story. It's inspired by that. It's also inspired by Eerie magazine, which I've been reading this collection of Eerie comics that I got from the library, and I just like how pulpy and how direct the stories are. So with this one, I really just wanted to get from one beat to the next beat and just push the story forward and have it move along at a faster pace. A comic book style one shot, if you will. I don't do a ton of like twist endings. Not that I'm not a fan of twist endings. I just think that sometimes they can be overused, or sometimes they can kind of throw the reader or throw the listener if you put one in the end where it's like, that didn't really land. But for this one, I really feel like the twist it wasn't a crazy huge twist, and it also was something that did lean on that pulpy, almost Tales from the Crypty creep show vibe. So I felt like the twist was necessary in this one. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really hope you are experiencing this Halloween season, watching some scary movies, reading some scary stories. Thank you for being here to listen to this story. I hope it's helping to elevate your season, to celebrate this time of year. And if you're listening to this in the future and it's not the Halloween season, I hope it embedded a little bit of spookiness and excitement into your week. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a plethora of ways you can do so. The first of which is just telling your family or friends about the podcast, maybe sharing a link with them. The second way you can support is by leaving a rating or review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That really does go a long way. It helps the algorithms that show podcasts to people, show this podcast to people who would want to hear it. And the third way you can support is joining us over on Patreon. There will be a link to that in the show notes. Huge shout out to all the patrons that are over there now. I am about to release a Behind the Tales episode for my story, The Heart of Gaia, very soon. Not only do you get that, you get early access to episodes over there and a few other things. However you support, thank you so much. I'll be back with another episode very soon. And until then, keep creating.